Welcome to TAC Makes, a podcast produced by the Art Center in Corvallis, Oregon. The following episode is one of 6 conversations between artists and collaborators involved with the exhibition Wildfire Water. Wildfire Water was made possible through a partnership with Playa in Summer Lake, Oregon, and is on view in the main gallery May 15th through July 5th, 2025.
My name is Maddi Bacon. I use they, them pronouns. I kind of have one foot in the conservation world, one foot in the art world. I've worked seasonally for a lot of public land agencies doing trail work, wildfire, biological science technician, and then I also have my own personal art practice, like writing and illustrating comics that frequently kind of overlaps with my interest in the environment and conservation.
I'm Dr. Katie Wollstein. I'm the Rangeland Fire Specialist with the OSU Extension Fire Program. I'm based out of Burns in Oregon at the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center. And my work focuses on, I provide technical expertise on rangeland and fire ecology, but also I help communities organize around wildfire and build community fire resilience.
And I'm Dr. E.J. Davis. I'm director of the Extension Fire Program at Oregon State University and an associate professor. And our fire program, we support a team of 6 regional fire specialists, so Katie and colleagues, who work around the state in place-based ways that make sense for local communities about their experiences with fire and what it looks like to be fire adapted for them. When I first came to Oregon many years ago, I traveled around the state for a project I was working on, trying to understand how people were collaborating to restore dry forest ecosystems. Now, those ecosystems were historically adapted to frequent fire, and it was part of their process. But over time, not having that frequent fire had really led to very different forest conditions and really different fire risks. Some of the earliest places where I learned about how people could collaborate and build shared understanding of that kind of ecosystem transformation and what we should do about it was different groups of community members, conservation groups, industry, government officials who were coming together and trying to identify new ways we could manage these forests. And I also learned a lot, just from being in Lake County, from like the way the wind sounds, the way the hills look, the way the Playa lakes look, all of that. And so it was only natural in 2015 when Katie and I started working together. Katie conducted her research in Lake County as well, but over on a different side, kind of looking at sage grouse management more out on the rangelands where I had been looking up on the forests. I think something I noticed in Lake County, or a sense I got quite a bit in Lake County, was that many of the people there had lived there a long time, and their lives were intertwined with this changing landscape. As they got older, as they moved through different phases of their work, the landscape around them started to change quite a lot. And Maddi, that's something that I think I really loved about the work that you came out with after working with Katie and being at Playa, was how you intertwined this story of your own life with this story of what's happening in our ecosystems in this way that was really personal, yet also like emotionally accessible, I guess I want to say. But I loved how your work progressed through the room and the experience of sort of moving through that. And like stepping through the time of your life and the time of the life of these landscapes. So,
and I really appreciate like what you say about the piece, and it's sort of the way I interwove it with kind of like my life and personal things. Because I think going into this project, like with this residency at Playa, like I had my own background in wildland fire. Like I had done a season of doing like wildland fire in Virginia, doing prescribed burns. I'd done some wildland suppression like out in the West, and already had sort of this like base knowledge like of fire. And the first couple pages of the comic are the first ones that I made, and it's like a little bit of like a fictional scene, like it's me and a like amorphous person, it's not really like defined, kind of reflective of like a moment that we had at the residency. And I think, Katie, I think it was when we went out, we were looking at the burn scar with you, and you had a couple of like exercises that we were like doing, like looking at the burn scar. And it was just like some comments that people had about like not being able to hear any birds and just like how sad it was. And like at the time I was just sort of like struck by this like this very like interesting observation where I was like, oh, like everyone is really sad about this burn scar and I'm not. And like, why is that? And I think there's like a lot of logical and cultural reasonings. Like I grew up on the East Coast where like wildfire like isn't nearly as big of a thing. Like I've never been afraid of like my house burning down. My introduction to fire was like doing fire on the East Coast, and like even within like wildland fire itself, like fire culture is very different in the East Coast. Like doing prescribed burns are so different than doing prescribed burns like out here in the West. Maybe less like filled with fear just because there is like a little bit less of a danger. Kind of started by making like that scene and like trying to like interrogate like in these other sort of like deeper sort of like emotional ephemeral ways, like what does that mean that like I feel differently about this than others? You know, like neither one of us is like right or wrong, but emotional things can like come out of that. And then like the rest of the comic was me just trying to like basically explain what those first couple pages were, because I was like, I just put a bunch of emotional stuff on the paper and now it needs to make sense somehow.
I like that you talk about kind of the emotions that you would attach to that place, or in this case, maybe didn't attach. Because the thing that makes places like that in Oregon really special is that people have lived there for a long time and they're really intimately engaged with the land. They see it every single day of the year for decades and decades. And so that emotional attachment looks pretty different than the rest of us who are coming in. And, you know, in my case, we're going to do a little science activity and what do you hear and what do you see? And so I also appreciate though, Maddi, you know, how you said that silence that maybe the others were observing. This was on that field trip to the Shiwakan watershed. And I think I shared with EJ here after that field trip, I had learned that 85% of that watershed had burned in the last 5 years, which is just astonishing. And so I appreciate, Maddi, that fire events, even if they're really extensive and really devastating, like that series of events were, there still is room for kind of a full spectrum of emotions and opportunities for hope. And I really appreciate that more nuanced view of fire, or maybe forward thinking and not a fixation on the devastation and loss, and the idea that there's a lot of complexity that remains, and then also we can kind of look ahead and see what else might come. And so I think your art really speaks to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think like I was also sort of, yeah, I think like grappling with that sort of like attachment that people like have to land, which I think is really special. And like I also feel like very attached to land and certain places, and what could a new future be and what does that really mean? And then it starts to get really slippery, because then we're back to like, oh, now we're, you know, engineering the environment and like moving plants around because we're like, well, this is what its new climate will be. And it gets quite messy really quick, but I think it's just a really interesting and complicated question for us to like ask ourselves.
That is one of the really interesting and possibly unique aspects of communities in Eastern Oregon, and specifically these rangeland dependent livelihoods like ranching. They're at the forefront of climate change, right? They are dependent on, you know, grass growing in predictable ways and that grass not burning. The environmental variability that they're experiencing has a lot to determine about how successful that year is going to go. And so in some ways, you know, there's a stereotype that folks out there aren't maybe cognizant of these broader global changes, but at the same time, these people have a front row view to these pretty noticeable changes. And so yeah, maybe we won't hear them say the words climate change, but you definitely hear in those conversations a recognition of some kind of changes year by year, seeing more extreme, larger, more frequent fires, you know, in present compared to maybe when they were kids on those very same ranches. And so in some ways, I learn, or not in some ways, in a lot of ways, I learn a lot from these people because they have more of that historical perspective that a scientist like myself doesn't necessarily have.
I wanted to ask you how you've been thinking about your work on public lands and out in the forest since doing this work with Playa and engaging with the scientists, how has that fed into your idea of kind of your next steps, how you want to be when you're working on the land, if anything? How's it
Mm.
influenced you?
I think that going into Playa, I had the perception that, like, ranchers and these other families are people that, are very connected to the land. Like, some of these are families that have like lived in like the same homes for several generations, and like they might not be like termed like scientists in a professional sense, but like they have so much knowledge, which is a thing I was aware of going into Playa, but I think Playa made me appreciate like even more that experience where we kind of got to like talk to and meet with like some of the families.
I was thinking back to what you both said about the different emotional experiences people have around fire or being in a burned landscape. I just want to say, Maddie, when I stepped into your room at Playa, I felt all the different emotions. Somehow they were there. It was the colors you had chosen, the way they were together. It was the strokes, like the texture with which you had created this. It allowed me to touch into the all the complex feelings I have about fire and all the whole world of sort of uncertainty, possibility, fear, divergences that's out there. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
You did it when I stepped in your room.
Oh, wow. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I was really pleased that someone chose to focus more on the rangy places in Oregon or portions of Lake County and those land uses. And I say that I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable here. So I work on rangelands. We're sparsely populated, pretty isolated just by definition, right? Anyone who's traveled to Eastern Oregon
Mm-hmm.
notices that there's very few urban centers. It's one of the reasons it's really special. But the downside to that is you can get isolated from other perspectives. And so one struggle we have in range management, also fire management, is other members of the public because they care about and love their public lands, and a lot of those lands are rangelands. They have opinions and ideas about how those lands should be managed for water, for wildlife, for wildfire. But if they've never spent time out in far Eastern Oregon, right? All the time I have people say, like, I've been to Bend, I've seen Eastern Oregon, and no, you haven't. That's in the middle of the state. There's a lot more
Uh-huh.
left. And so one thing we really struggle to do out there is to communicate with the half or two-thirds of the state that doesn't make it out to see us, to see, first of all, see these landscapes for themselves, but also understand better the ecology and why it requires that we manage in the ways we do and our struggles with fire. Also the ways people are making a living. And again, a lot of these families really care about and treasure that land. And it's hard for us to tell that story. And so I was delighted, Maddie, that you're kind of taking up telling that story. First of all, just being a different storyteller than I would ever be able, or tell that story in a way that I would never be able to do it. But also, my hope is that this reaches audiences that we also wouldn't be able to reach. So I thought it was a really, really cool opportunity and really unique way to communicate about what we're facing out here.
Yeah, I mean, don't sell yourself too short, Katie. Your presentations were amazing at Playa, and I think you did like a really excellent job in your presentation, sort of like grappling, I think, with like a little bit of that, I guess, like a little bit of a disconnect that like the state of Oregon has. Like it is a little bit of a west versus east, just like in the same way, and like with like wildlife, people like gravitate towards like the big megafaunas, like pandas and whales. Like in other nature, like people are like drawn to giant trees and like big like mega flora.
It captures the imagination, right? Like their lives and livelihoods and culture are a lot more intimately intertwined with nature, to use that broadly, than I
Mm-hmm.
would say, for folks in more urban environments or who have professions that don't matter if it rains on Tuesday or something.
I am very afraid for this upcoming fire season. While I don't think that for the most part it was not main duty fire people being terminated, there's like a lot of fire that runs because it's other people's ancillary duties. So even though fire is not their main duty, they're part of an incident command team.
And Maddie kind of alluded to this, but I want to elaborate. So it's not just about having enough humans to fight wildfires. The other way the federal workforce is being impacted is just gutting the land management workforce. So employees at the U.S. Forest Service, at the Bureau of Land Management, honestly, even the Natural Resource Conservation Service. I share a building with the Agricultural Research Service. The thing is, all of these people, their jobs are meant to they're statutorily mandated to make sure that these lands are being cared for. And so some of this is, making sure that ranchers are, using their allotted amount of grass and they aren't overgrazing a place. Some of them are ensuring that water quality is all right in these places. But the other piece of that is some of those jobs are also fuels management that needs to happen long before the fire season. And that work will make sure that we don't get these big scary fires that Maddie had referred to. And so for me, especially in a really small community, I live in Burns, we're about 5,000 people. The land management agencies are big employers out here because we have so much public land. And so it also deeply affects the community just in terms of people being employed here, but also it affects just the care of these lands. If there are not enough humans in the office to be doing the things that make sure that public lands are, remaining productive and healthy and people are getting access, that is a loss for all of us, right? Those lands are held in trust for the American public. And so it isn't just those employees losing, it is all of us.
I am always sort of like wondering like what are sort of like what should our like realistic goals be to try and like have this like better kind of like relationship with prescribed burning, because like that's what I want. Like I associate like prescribed burning is this like super fun thing that I get to go and like do, and you really get to learn about the land and fire, and then it's good for the land. And like I have this sort of like biased opinion that I like want prescribed burning to be this like super like common thing, but sometimes I like wonder like how do we get there like with all these current insurmountable things.
Well, this is where I gently remind you, Maddie, that prescribed burning is a tool, just like grazing is a tool, just like cutting juniper, heavy fuels is a tool. And so there's actually a bigger question even that you didn't quite get to, which is how do we make sure and apply the right tools in the right places so that they actually translate to improved fire dynamics on these really large landscapes? And if we ask that question, this is in fact my favorite question in the world, and it's actually a big focus on my work at the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center with other colleagues, right? And you teed it up perfectly, which is these are really complex, yes, ecological landscapes, ecological systems, but also the underlying social and political landscapes are as if not more complex. And so the thing about rangelands and other natural systems, honestly, is that the same management practices will not work in the same place nor in every year to, reduce fire risk. And so how on earth do you enact management and kind of slot it in this broader scheme to make sure that the things you are doing are actually strategic and they're also going to make a difference? And oh, by the way, we don't have enough resources. We don't have enough humans. We don't have enough, seeding for rehabilitation. We don't have enough cows to reduce fine fuel. And so how do we make sure we're putting the right tools in the right places again to make a difference? My work focuses a lot on strategic range and fire planning. And so how can we look at really large landscapes, think about the conditions there in the place, what are the likely outcomes if there were to be a fire in a particular spot? And if those are negative or undesirable, what management needs to happen today to change those outcomes, with a recognition that that management is probably going to be different in a bunch of different places because of those different biotic and abiotic conditions across this really variable landscape. And so doing that planning, not only just, as a tabletop exercise, but getting everyone on board and then all moving in the same direction, right? Actually implementing that plan across those ownership boundaries, like that, if we want to talk about the future, that is what we all need to be doing in order to be adapted to wildfire, not just on rangelands, but frankly on all landscapes that are going to be burning in the future.
Thanks for listening to TAC Makes a Podcast. You can find more episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and at theartscenter.net. That's arts with an S. Be sure to follow us on all platforms so you never miss an episode. Keep creating, keep connecting, and we'll see you next time.